I'm sure some people may still join us as we get going. But welcome everyone this morning. I want to talk to you today about whether all leadership is in fact digital leadership, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end if anyone wants to ask questions or add to the debate. Really. So I'm Dr. Deborah Smart. I work at Dorset Council, and I'm the corporate director there, responsible for digital and change. So I'm a senior leader responsible for developing a digital culture in what is actually a fairly new organisation. Dorset Council is only just sort of 2 years old, having been formed from predecessor councils in, as I say, 2 years ago. I've become increasingly curious about the separation of leadership development programs and digital leadership development programs. I myself have done many different kind of leadership development over the years, both sort of structured programs similar to sort of MBAs. Also, my PhD involved thinking about leadership, culture, and management. But more recently, I've been doing a leadership development program in digital leadership, and I've become increasingly curious about why then are we talking about digital leadership as something separate from leadership development? Are they really different? And why are they? They seem to be funded differently, certainly within organisations with mainstream funding for lots of leadership development. But when it comes to digital development, we have to fund that from within the digital budget. So why have we sort of separated these things out? Because actually, isn't all leadership digital leadership? So I thought, how am I going to talk this morning about this and try and persuade you that I think these things are actually the same? So I took some time to look at, what kind of traditional leadership training you might get if you joined an MBA program. And these are the kind of topics that you tend to cover: finance, strategy, comms and marketing, operations management, managing people, sort of HR issues, innovation, and then often a bit about leadership and personal development. It's very sort of typical in those kind of programs that you start off by filling out a sort of personal development plan at the beginning, and then working through as you go through the modules, and learn about sort of traditional management. But what do you learn in digital leadership? So what am I learning in my digital leadership training? Well, I'm also learning about how to implement strategy and change in the organisation. I'm also learning about comms and marketing, but particularly sort of social media. I'm learning things about the essentials of digital systems and how technology and information hierarchies become built up in organisations over the years. I'm learning techniques around user-centered design and citizen-driven informatics. I'm learning things about knowledge management and analytics. And again, I'm still learning about my own personal development and my leadership style. So shouldn't we just then include bits about digital in sort of traditional leadership training? Shouldn't we just include within the finance module how we can make our leaders confident that the cost models that they're using to predict how their services are going to change over time, and the impacts of, if I take local authority example, how we model impacts of changes in demand, for example, in adult social care? Shouldn't we just include those kind of digital bits within finance, and indeed in strategy? Perhaps we just need a bit of digital strategy bolted on, or isn't actually our digital strategy the heart of our organisational strategy? Do we really do comms and marketing now without being digital? I don't know that we do. How could we really teach operations management in the way that I learnt it 20 years ago now without thinking about IoT and what that's going to do? Would we still teach kind of traditional HR management without thinking about, certainly since the pandemic, but even before that, what we mean to be flexible, modern? And would we really kind of talk about innovation without thinking about how we have a sort of agile culture where we test and learn things? And I think for me, one of the most important things in sort of the digital way, if you like, is this ability and need to be constantly learning as technology is always changing. And that's sort of different from sort of chunking it up methods that we might have had before. So I don't think you can just bolt digital intertraditional leadership training, I think we need to rethink the whole thing. And why do I think that? Well, let's look at a different kind of aspect of leadership, which is the thing that's very fond to my heart, is about leaders, leading and shaping the culture of an organisation. And don't we all want to have organisations that are human-centred, that experiment, that are innovative, that have a coaching approach, that learn from others and share their learning, that work in the open, that aren't scared to try things and fail and test and learn, that have, where leaders have advanced change management skills, they work on developing other leaders, and they can work with uncertainty. I think those are the sort of things that we all aspire to have in our culture, not just in a digital culture, in our organisational culture. So I think we need to be developing leaders who can lead in that way. When I think then about data, AI, machine learning, I think, could we have leaders that didn't really understand this? I don't think we can. I think it's absolutely fundamental that we are developing our leaders in ways that they can understand the implications of this. We obviously can do things now that we could never do before. I think the question there for me is, but should we? Leaders need to be understanding ethical implications of working with data and predictive analytics. I'm not saying we all have to be able to write the actual algorithms, but we need to be able to lead in a way that asks credible questions and that demonstrates our understanding, and that we know the implications of what we're doing, and therefore the decisions, on what basis we're making our decisions. I think we also need to understand the proportionality of the way that we collect data. There's a growing body of evidence in research about the impact on staff of filling out data and information in systems where they feel that it's never used. How much does that take away from frontline ability to actually deliver the services that we want staff to do? And how do we, when we are collecting our data and we are thinking about how we need to use that data and information to lead and make decisions, how are we inculcating a quality culture so that the information that we have is accurate and reliable and we can make those decisions? And I think for me, when I go back to looking at the sort of modules that you might teach on a sort of traditional leadership development, I think fundamentally missing out of that is the ability to lead and make decisions based on information and data. I think, as we go forward, we've already seen it through the pandemic become very, very marked in the council, where we've had to start collecting data that we've never had before and started making decisions based on that information that we've now collected about citizens in order to help them through the pandemic, and indeed our own staff. I think helping, teaching, making sure we have leaders who can do that and lead in that way is going to be fundamental to organisations going forward. So on the other side then, I don't often like to talk about the negatives, I always like to stay on the positive, but sometimes it is worth just saying, well, what would happen to your organisational reputation if we didn't have leaders with digital skills and we didn't see digital leadership as fundamental to all leaders? We've seen the "I'm not a cat, I can't take my filter off" in the news, and we've all had a good laugh about that. But actually, what do we feel now when people start a presentation and they say, "I'm just going to try and share my screen," and then they can't manage to do it for 3 or 4 minutes? They lose credibility. So we need to help people with the simple things, but we also need to help them with being confident about that. I've seen a growing tension now between sort of traditional management techniques about people wanting to get their teams back in the office so they can see what they're doing. Sort of, I'm going to come in, so therefore, you need to come in, those kind of implications. So I think we need leaders who can manage that flexibility, who are confident at using the digital tools we have now in front of us, and are not hankering to get back into the office, because wouldn't it be easier if we all went back to the old ways where I didn't have to worry about whether I was capable of sharing my screen or not, or indeed, as happened in many organisations, shared the wrong screen. I think the other thing that comes to mind around how we try and inculcate sort of digital leadership I'm just getting a bit of an echo. If someone can go on mute, that would be really appreciated. Thank you. Is leaders who clearly don't understand technology. And I think this is increasingly obvious that we cannot have leaders in organisations who don't really understand technology. And how this manifests itself, in my experience, is they have ridiculous timescales for wanting to get things done. And particularly in the council, I mean, you know, as I said, we're a new council coming together, but of course our technology isn't all new. You know, we've got this huge, complex technical infrastructure, architecture that's been built up over many years, and that's the same in the private sector. I know, because I've worked with you know, financial services institutions. At the bottom of the stack is very, very old technology. So not understanding some of the complexities of that can lead into sort of demands that are quite difficult and almost ridiculous to deliver on, and become uncredible. Leaders who don't understand technology also have no idea of the likely costs, and they don't understand the whole life cost then of potentially swapping out technology. Some things might be simple, easy and quick and cheap, and I know certainly at Dorset we're moving to things at the top of the stack where we can do things in that way. But actually, some of the fundamental line of business systems that we have are huge pieces of complex technology where we need to keep the data that we've built up in those systems for many, many years to come. And even understanding that is important. We, you know, recently come to light that we've in swapping a system, we haven't maintained all the data that we needed to do. Luckily, we had some printed copies, but doesn't that seem a bit old school to be relying on printed copies to go into the archives? I think sometimes leaders say we just need to change the system. This is a solution, with no real understanding of the problem. And the more I see that, the more I think this is what we need to move away from, and we need to educate our leaders so that they don't think in that way, and they don't just see technology as a black box and it just needs to be sorted out. That we do need to have leaders who've got credible understanding of this. And I think the last thing is about technical debt. So as I've just talked about, we've got this complex architecture and infrastructure. You know, we do need to have enough investment to make sure that we're not building up problems for the future. Making sure that our architecture is safe and secure, and we're not opening the door for any cyber attacks and all those things. I don't think leaders can be leaders without those kind of understandings of technology. I think there is then a further kind of thing to think about, which is about navigating new organisational issues that I see coming to the fore now that do involve technology in some way. And I think this is, for me, why there is no separation between leadership and digital leadership, because I cannot imagine if we don't prepare our leaders to deal with some of these things, that we can have good leadership in an organisation. So when does care become surveillance? This is an interesting one for me in the council. We obviously talk a lot about reducing the cost of care, helping people to stay in their own homes by implementing IoT devices, robots whose name begins with A or G or S. I'm not going to say any of those because they'll suddenly spark to life and interrupt my presentation. But at what point does that become an intrusion on people's lives? How are we thinking about that ethically? I think certainly from my point of view, we've got much more sort of work surveillance now than we ever had. We've talked about when we can go back into the office, should we have monitors so we can see which desks are used and which teams are in the office more than others? And that seems, at one face of it, a fairly good kind of argument about understanding utilisation and what kind of office space we might need. And if we don't need as much of it, then that's absolutely brilliant, isn't it? Because we could potentially repurpose it or share it with some of our other colleagues in the public sector and get some money for the council. That would be ideal. But then what does that mean if I'm sitting here in Southampton and I can monitor who's sitting at what desk in Dorchester? Is that right? We've noticed that the always on presence in Teams has been driving some peculiar behaviour, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. I've lost count of the number of times, and some colleagues from my team on the call here, I think every single team meeting I have talked about the importance of taking breaks. I've talked about the importance of going offline and reading things and not being always on green or red, and that it is absolutely fine to go into an amber state, to take breaks, and to look after yourself. And when we started moving to working from home at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a huge lack of trust. And we've seen an ever more pervasive way of different roles and job roles being sort of monitored and managed, with the sort of thinking that if you're sitting at home, you're not actually doing your work. And I don't think we can have leaders who think in that way and work in that way. And where we do need to do things because of the sound managerial reason, we are thinking about the implications and what kind of behaviours that might drive in the organisation, and indeed how we talk about the data that we're collecting and that we need to use it. I think leaders also need to have a better understanding of the total inability now for us to separate our lives out. You know, digital lives don't separate work, social, political, sexual lives, and shopping. It's all in one device, isn't it? I use my iPhone to do all of those things in some way or shape or form. And we've had an interesting conversation this morning around whether personal WhatsApp messages between colleagues could be subject to freedom of information requests, or subject access requests indeed. And that seems like a very kind of difficult conversation. It was a very difficult conversation to have, because it's my phone, it's my personal device. I've done things that are potentially work related, or potentially I've been gossiping with another work colleague about another work colleague. But shouldn't I be allowed to do that on my own personal phone? At what point then does that become information that the council can ask for, or indeed a member of the public could ask for? I think navigating things like this is and navigating our way through it, thinking about how we help ourselves and staff to manage that, is organisational problems that we're living with at the moment, but we're not really necessarily talking about. I think then there's also about how organisations talk about technology. I'm very fascinated about this, how leaders can then navigate those patterns, and think about how technology is taken up. So I've talked a bit before about, we have leaders who sort of take against their systems, and it's all the fault of system X that we can't possibly do whatever it is that we're trying to do well, and not really understanding the problem. But I think it's wider than that. Is it the digital team's responsibility to be teaching everybody about digital? Is it the team's responsibility to be leading on the projects where they need to change the technology and think about how to advance that for the future? Or is it in fact everybody's job now, because we're all living with digital and all living with technology? I think leaders have a role across the organisation in shaping those conversations and making sure that there's not a siloed thinking, or a one, it's reliant on one small team to do all of that work. We should all be thinking about that. And lastly, it was dear to my heart. You've probably seen some of my team with their week notes on social media. I'm very keen to be working in the open. That's fundamental for me, about having an open culture, being open and transparent, which is again part of how the council works anyway. But it's very interesting to see the sort of rivalries that this sparks between teams. So how our working in the open is taken up with our tweets, and our celebrating our successes very publicly to other teams in the organization, is we're always blowing our own trumpet. The digital team think they're so great, aren't they? Look at them always celebrating what they're doing. And of course, indeed, we're often not celebrating what we're doing, but talking about things that we've not quite got right on the basis that we can help others learn. But I think, or, navigating those organizational realities of how we start to change the way that we work and start to change the culture, is something that we need to equip leaders with for the future. So in case you haven't worked this out yet, I'm just hammering it home. I fundamentally believe that all leadership now needs to be digital leadership. I think we've looked at the kind of traditional way we might think about training leaders where digital is kind of tangential. We've looked at specialist digital leadership training programs, and indeed the sort of ones that I've been on. But I think we're missing something still by doing that, and this is why I feel we need to bring it together. Because unless we bring it together, we will not start to talk and teach leaders how we deal with ethical issues associated with data, associated with surveillance, associated with monitoring, associated with all the things that I've touched on this morning. And I think leaders do need to be equipped to think about that. They need to be thinking about the complexity and managing in complexity. Things are not linear. They're not simple at all in organizations. They never have been, but even more so now with the added complications of digital. We want leaders to be able to manage in uncertainty. It's an uncertain world. I think the speed of change, the pace of change means it's very, very difficult to predict things in ways that actually even only 5 or 10 years ago would have been much more easy. We want people to lead remotely well, so we don't surely we don't want leaders to be sitting in Southampton monitoring who's sitting at which desks in Dorchester. I really hope not. We want to make sure that is promoting a culture of inclusivity and equity. So there's a lot of my team who've been able to do extra hours because they haven't got their commute time, increasing their household income where we've had the work available, and they don't want to go back to spending an hour in the car going backwards and forwards to work. But we do need to work out how we do that without putting undue pressure on others, because we also are social creatures and we want to come into the office to see and work together. We need leaders who can manage these blurred boundaries between home and work lives, I think. And I don't think we really have thought enough about that. We've sort of all enjoyed looking into each other's houses, haven't we, through our screens? And if I didn't have my background on, you would get a little window of what my room looks like. We've met people's pets and children and through working, but we've really in other ways as well started to blur those boundaries where we don't have separate devices for home and work. What does that mean? What will that do? And lastly, I think, very close to my heart is, what kind of culture are we creating? How are we creating a culture where we're embracing all of these things, all of these difficulties, these complexities, this new technology? How are we supporting people to learn and constantly learn? I think that's, for me, is the most important thing, is allowing. I've had so many conversations, well, can I take some work time just to learn and get better at using Microsoft Teams, Deborah? Well, of course you can, because it's absolutely fundamental to us being able to do our work, that you can use the tools and technology that we're providing. So leading that culture, leading that experimentation, that agile way of working, because that's how we need to be approaching all our work, I believe. And that's absolutely fundamental. So I hope I've persuaded you this morning that all leadership needs to be digital leadership, that we need to be thinking about some of these complex problems that are emerging for us, I think, in organisations, in ways that we often don't talk about it. We often cover over those things. I've talked today very much from my own personal perspective. I've used some examples from Dorset. I could have used some examples from elsewhere. And I just want to say thank you for your time this morning. If anyone wants to ask any questions or contribute, then please come on camera and come off mute and ask away. I can't see any hands up, or I can't see anybody wanting to come on and contribute anymore. And we're just nearly at our end of our time for 30 minutes. So thank you very much for joining me this morning. I hope I've provoked some thoughts. Do get in touch with me if you want to carry on thinking about these themes and how we might develop them, on what we should be doing and how we should be leading kind of leadership development. Thank you very much. Goodbye from Dorset.